All right, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining the NRRI webinar on PURPA. My name is Elliott Nethercutt with the National Regulatory Research Institute. Now, I'm sure many of you maybe have gotten your fill for PURPA for 2019, but we are ready to re-engage you all with a terrific group of panelists today as FERC continues to mull over the 120 plus sets of comments that were submitted late last year. So with that in mind, the goal of today, of course, is not to resolve every PURPA problem, but we are looking to find some common ground among the NRRI comments and really have a meaningful discussion as FERC deliberates on a final rule. So I think it's important to note that 4 of 5 of our panelists today do represent organizations that did provide comments to FERC. And the 5th, Dr. Celebi, he is a real industry expert who's done a lot of work on PURPA over the years. Now, before I get into introductions, I'd like to first thank Tom Stanton and Catherine Klein here at NRRI for their guidance in the organization of this webinar. Also, a big thanks to Victor Arujo for his support on the IT logistics. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, NRRI was founded in 1976 by NRRI to serve as the research arm for state commissioners throughout the country. Our mission is to produce and disseminate relevant and applicable research, and additionally, we provide objective information and training, which includes webinars like this one. So for today's logistics, basically I'm going to be your moderator for today. I'm going to kick off by providing a quick background on PURPA, along with an outline of the various components of the NOPR. And then I'll introduce our 5 panelists individually, and they will offer their opening remarks. And then we will carry on with some discussion. Now, we're going to save 15 minutes at the end for questions. And as a reminder, everyone with the exception of our panelists is in listen-only mode. And I'd also ask panelists to keep their phones on mute when they are not speaking to avoid any background noise. Now, for those of you in the audience who would like to ask some questions during the webinar, please use the chat feature. And then Tom and I will review and select a couple so that our panel can respond during the Q&A. Now, after that, I'd ask that you all stay tuned for some announcements for some upcoming NARUC and NRRI events. So now on to the PURPA background. PURPA was originally enacted in 1978 to create more access for small generation facilities. This legislation was crafted during a time when the growth rate of electricity demand was relatively high, and there was minimal use of natural gas for electric generation. And the conversation was really focused on many policies. The implementation of PURPA was at one point considered the most direct and obvious motivation for using competition and competitive bidding in selecting and pricing non-utility generation. Now, as with any public policy, circumstances change over time, and that can significantly impact implementation outcomes. And I think that's what we've really seen in the EIA chart on the left, which demonstrates the changes in qualifying facilities added as a percentage of total renewable capacity during the past 4 decades. Now, several factors have impacted the addition of qualifying facilities over the years. We've got substantial changes in the resource mix, including the introduction of new technologies that have changed the characteristics of the electric system. Deregulation and a growing role of wholesale electricity markets has also played a role. And then, of course, you have the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which exempted utilities from buying from QFs over 20 megawatts, as well as those with non-discriminatory access to wholesale markets. In some states, legislation such as renewable portfolio standards have also been enacted. And finally, there have been changes in the production costs of solar and other small generation. Now, while PURPA establishes the federal framework, it allows for state-specific implementation. And that's pretty much what we see in the chart on the right, which shows that states have taken that framework and run in many different directions. California and more recently North Carolina have clearly become attractive states for renewable developers that are interested in establishing QF status. Now, some of the ongoing challenges for many state commissions include determining the methods for establishing avoided cost rates for both energy and capacity, whether or not to use these rates as fixed, and if so, when does a legally enforceable obligation begin? And if you do fix the rates, how many years should those rates be fixed? Now, forecasting electricity demand and understanding how these projections interplay with future capacity needs is already a complicated task. Now, layered on top of this, as we've seen in the NRRI comments, is determining how to factor in QFs with parameters that constitute a reasonable balance between financial viability of small power producers while also protecting the interest of ratepayers. And states must navigate these challenges through a patchwork of vertically and non-vertically integrated utilities that operate both within and outside of wholesale electricity markets. I think we could probably talk all day and have an entire webinar dedicated to any one of the 5 NRRI components, but I think all are up for discussion today. I didn't think it was possible to get the 137-page NRRI into a single slide, but here you go. Please keep in mind this is an extremely high-level overview. And again, first, we have the avoided cost rates that probably offer the most opportunity for some consensus, or at least some good discussion today. And I say this because there's so much flexibility offered to states, including the ability to allow energy rates to vary or tie fixed rates to projected prices at the time of delivery. States with entities that participate in wholesale electricity markets can also tie them to the LMP. And for those in non-market areas, prices can be tied to a liquid market hub or utilize a formula that incorporates gas prices and heat rates. And finally, there's an ability to opt for the competitive solicitation route, which we see in several states already. And next, we have the proposed modification to the 1-mile rule, which continues the assumption of a single facility when under a mile apart. It allows parties to demonstrate a combined facility for units between 1 and 10 miles apart and considers those more than 10 miles apart to be separate. So another proposed change was basically the modification of the presumption that facilities over 1 megawatt have non-discriminatory access to markets. Previously, the threshold was 20 megawatts. The fourth proposal would require states to establish some parameters around whether a QF is commercially viable and has financial commitment before issuing a legally enforceable application. And last but not least, FERC proposes allowing parties to challenge the status of qualified facilities without filing or paying for a declaratory action or order. So I really hope this outline is useful for those who are not as familiar with PURPA and the NRRI. So now I'm going to introduce each of our panelists prior to their respective opening remarks. I'm going to start with Dr. Celebi of Brattle. Dr. Celebi provides expertise in the electricity markets and analysis of environmental and climate policy. He has consulted primarily in the areas of electricity spot pricing and market design. And as I mentioned before, Dr. Celebi has done a lot of work on PURPA, and I think he has a really comprehensive understanding of its history and evolving application over the years. He received his PhD in economics from Boston College, along with a master's degree in economics from Bilkent University in Turkey. He also has a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering, and that's quite a combination. So, Dr. Celebi, let's kick us off now.
Thank you, Elliott, and good afternoon, everybody. So I have a few slides here that I would like to go through. These are my views and not the common views of the Brattle group, so please consider them as my personal observations. So if you could go to the agenda slide, slide 2, Elliott. What I will talk about today is provide first a very brief summary of NRRI, given that Elliott already provided a nice overview. Then I will talk about the continued lack of a volumetric cap on the mandate for utilities to purchase power from the QF. I will then explain while PURPA's relevance has gotten smaller in some regions, it continues to have relevance in some others. Finally, I will go into my suggested refinements to NRRI, namely focused the changes in PURPA implementation on states outside the organized wholesale markets, namely RTOs, and the ones with weak or saturated RPS regimes. The second one is to deal with the renewable QF oversubscription in some of those states. Third, I argue that there is a need to add further requirements to show that variable or floating energy price component of the avoided cost rates comports with providing new QFs with, in quotes, reasonable opportunities to attract capital from potential investors. And the last one, if those requirements cannot be satisfied, then require the utility to convert some of those options into some requirements that I'm going to explain. If you could go to the next slide, slide 3. This is just my very quick summary of the NOPR. But before I go into those key terms in the NOPR, I think FERC made 2 key observations in NOPR to support the proposed changes. The first one is fixed avoided cost pricing over the term of the QF contracts largely resulted in overestimations relative to actual avoided cost that has been declining. A key driver of the declining actual avoided cost was the continued decrease in long-term forecast for gas prices, and to a lesser extent, the decreases in the load growth forecast and increases in penetration of renewables. The second observation that FERC made is wholesale markets, RTOs essentially, have developed in many parts of the US, and many non-QF renewables have been developed. So with these 2 key observations, FERC's proposal, I would categorize them under 4 pieces. The first one is providing an option to states to implement variable as delivered avoided cost energy pricing in the QF contracts. The second one is providing an option to states to implement RFPs. The third one is some select curtailing of utility must purchase requirements if they lose some of their load under retail choice. And then the last one is some limits on QF eligibility, like the ones that Elliott described. I will focus on the first 2 of these NOPR sections. If you could turn to slide 4. So with all these proposed changes in the NOPR, I think the lack of volumetric cap on utilities must purchase requirement continues under NOPR. So there is no explicit discussion of putting a volumetric cap. Currently, PURPA implementation tries to ration the QF entry by price, not by quantity or volume. But the avoided cost rates have not been sufficiently flexible or dynamic in many states to perform this rationing role, hence resulted in oversubscriptions in some states. However, NOPR partially mitigates the lack of volumetric cap through 2 things. One is reinforcing the price discipline through option to implement variable energy rates, the RFP option, and by clarifying that the capacity component of avoided cost can be 0 if the state determines the utility's demand for capacity is also 0. The second way NOPR mitigates this issue is by reducing the must purchase requirement if load essentially migrates through retail access. If you could go to slide 5. In slide 5, I talk about the geographic relevance of PURPA and how it varies by region. While FERC argued that many non-QF renewables have been developed in the US, PURPA is still relevant for renewables development in non-RTO states with low RPS requirements. The map on that slide shows the states under RTOs with yellow coloring and the states with high RPS requirements with a gray pattern. The remaining states which are shown in the red circles, mostly in the west and southeast, represent about 1/3 of the total generation capacity in the US. And those states have no RTOs and have typically lower RPS requirements compared to the others. Many of these states, and you'll see on the table to the right of the map, many of those states, they show up in the top 10 states with QF entry, qualifying facility entry, since 2009. North Carolina had about 4.5 gigawatt of new QF since 2009, followed by California, etc. And almost 1/3 of the QF capacity that came online since 2009 in the US are in the 4 states that I highlight there. Those are all non-RTO and weaker RPS states. These are North Carolina, Idaho, Utah, and Georgia. So if you could change to slide 6. The chart on this slide supports the argument that PURPA continues to be relevant in non-RTO and the weak RPS states. It shows the renewables as a percentage of regional capacity on a nationwide basis, which is the dashed line, going from near zero in 2000 to about 12% recently. And that versus the percentage of renewables as a percentage of regional capacity in non-RTO and weak RPS regions. Those are in the bars. So compared to the renewable share as a percentage of capacity recently, renewable share is substantially lower in non-RTO and low RPS regions. So it's about less than 6% there for the non-RTO and low RPS regions. In addition, within that renewable entry, the QFs represent almost half of the current renewable capacity in those states. The orange bar is the portion of the regional capacity that's coming from QFs, and the bottom one is the portion of the renewable coming from non-QF generation. In contrast to this large share of the QF in the renewables in those states, nationwide share of the QF in renewables is currently much lower, about 18%. That's not shown on the chart. If you could turn to the next slide. So while PURPA is still relevant in non-RTO and the low RPS regions, some of those states have been experiencing an oversubscription problem. Currently, out of the 35 gigawatt of total qualifying facilities under development, those are basically not the ones that are built yet, but under development. Out of that 35 gigawatt, 25 gigawatt is concentrated in 10 states, including Montana, Carolinas, etc. And many of those 10 states are outside RTOs. So the chart there shows as a percentage of the QFs under development in total capacity in the state, Montana is at the top. It basically has 35% of the total existing capacity there is under development as QFs potentially coming online in the future years. Similarly, South Carolina also has a large percentage there. In contrast, the national average of the QFs in development as a percentage of total capacity is less than 5%. It's more like 3%. So there is a large concentration of the renewable in development and QFs in development. If you could go to slide 8. Here's my synopsis of the comments made in response to NOPR. Based on my review of a sample of the comments, I didn't have a chance to look at all 120 comments yet, but we are still reading some. I think what I will summarize is, I think there is agreement that it's time to modernize the PURPA rules, but there are differing views on how to balance statutory directive against just and reasonable rates. There is some general support for RFPs, which amount to implicit volumetric caps on QF development. But the variable energy rate option has its supporters and opponents. Utilities argue that the current PURPA rules resulted in overpayments, hence burdens for ratepayers. Therefore, these reforms proposed by PERC are appropriate. But at the same time, many other parties note the continuing importance of PURPA for developers in non-RTO regions. If you could turn to the next slide. I have 3 slides left. So my observations on the NOPR are summarized in this slide. Basically, I have 3 points, 3 general points. One is PURPA continues to have a role in supporting development of renewable QF in non-RTO states with weak RPS goals. Second, reforms are needed to PURPA implementation as the major shifts in some market fundamentals resulted in oversubscription in some states due in part to inflexible avoided cost regime and fixed rates over the term of the contract. It also resulted in reaction in some states to shorten the duration of QF contracts. And then the last one, it resulted in adverse impact on QF developers' ability to attract capital from potential investors. The third point I want to make about NOPR is, while the NOPR mitigate the oversubscription problem through options to implement variable energy prices and RFPs, further refinements to NOPR would mitigate the concerns about financeability while achieving cost-effective implementation of PURPA. If you could turn to slide 10. Based on the observations I have explained earlier, I suggest the following refinements to NOPR. One is the recognition to focus on how best to implement PURPA in non-RTO states with weak RPS regimes, because non-QF renewables outside these states have benefited from access to robust wholesale markets and RPS regimes. The second one is there needs to be more focus on how to deal with oversubscription in those non-RTO and weak RPS states. The third one has a little bit more specificity to it. If a state chooses to go with the variable energy rate option, consider requirements that would strengthen the contractual terms and transparency to mitigate concerns on financeability. Those things could be requirement to have future energy prices indexed to liquid hubs via a transparent formula. This improves the ability of QF developers and investors to predict future energy rates. Second, potentially minimum durations for contracts if the variable energy rate option is chosen, in recognition that the current requirement to fix rates over the term of the contracts resulted in some states to shorten the QF contract durations. And the third one that could be considered is evergreen mandatory purchase obligations up to initially agreed on contract duration that would survive changes in PURPA law in the Congress. And lastly, if those requirements can't be met, then require either fixed energy rates based on forecast of available market indices or independent monitored RFPs to procure capacity and energy in regular intervals. My last slide, slide 11, is about potential refinements to NOPR for the RFP option to assure transparent and non-discriminatory process and outcome. These will be things like requiring RFPs in regular intervals, for example, every year. Also require that the total procurement target to be based on the utility needs identified in a commission-approved IRP to avoid concerns about utility understating the total amount to be RFP'd in favor of utility on new generation. Independent monitoring of the types and products and evaluation criteria would also help with concerns on having level access in meeting the utility needs. And incentivize the participation and competitive offers in the RFPs by clarifying that larger QFs that did not win or participate should be offered to enter into energy-only QF contracts to the extent the capacity needs of the utility are already satisfied in the RFP. And there could be potential exemptions for smaller QFs to obtain contracts based on the RFP results, even if they didn't participate in the RFP because of the high transaction or participation cost. So that completes my slide deck. I'm looking forward to the discussion and questions. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Dr. Celebi. And next we'll hear from Chairman Dutrieuille. And she is chairman of the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission, where she is serving her second term. Chairman Dutrieuille focuses her efforts on educating consumers, enhancing the safety and reliability of utility services, and exploring innovations for the future. Chairman Dutrieuille earned her bachelor's degree and her JD degrees from the University of Pittsburgh, and she is a member of the Pennsylvania Bar Association, among several other associations. She also serves on NRRI's committees on critical infrastructure and electricity. So, Chairman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elliott, and thank you for the opportunity to provide some comments on Pennsylvania's comments that we submitted for the PURPA NOPR. I thought it was important to give you an idea of our landscape, the changes that were made in Pennsylvania over the years, which resulted in some of the comments that we submitted for this NOPR. So if you go to the next slide, one of the first things in Pennsylvania is changing of our landscape in terms of removing ourselves from the generation side of it for our Public Utility Commission. Back in 1996, when this legislation was introduced and then passed by the General Assembly, the concern that was expressed by the Public Utility Commission at that time is that in Pennsylvania, our rates for consumers for their electricity was probably 15% higher than the national average. And as a result, and trying to find ways to reduce that so the burden wouldn't be so much on the consumer, but for allowing for the marketplace to set the price, the General Assembly passed the Electricity Generation Customer Choice and Competition Act that was signed by the governor in December of 1996 and then went into effect in January of 1997. So with that, our EDCs divested from generation, but they maintained the role to be a default service provider. For those persons that did not want to shop, they could still get their generation from their EDC. And so we're one of the first successful retail customer choice programs. Going on to the next slide is just a chart of what we put out monthly in terms of the amount of people that are shopping here in Pennsylvania. Currently, there's a little over 1.8 million customers that are shopping for their electricity. I think at our highest amount over the years, we were as high as 2.1 million in terms of customer shopping. The other background information there is we also are one of those states that has a lot of electricity, but we'll get into that with the next slide. A lot of natural gas, I meant. So if you look at the next slide, in terms of our wholesale generation, we are a major exporter of power in the PJM region, producing approximately 202.5 million megawatt hours in 2018 and exporting about 24% of that. So our total electric production consists of 40%, which is nuclear, 29.6%, which is natural gas, 20.7%, which is coal, 3% hydro, 1.7% wind, with the remaining amount a mix of solar, battery, and petroleum resources. As we continue along the discussion of nuclear across the country, our nuclear generation, we currently have 4 plants that are comprised of 8 units, recognizing the fact that we did have a single plant, TMI, that closed in September of 2019. Moving on to the next slide, another area in terms of the energy landscape in Pennsylvania, where we saw changes made by the General Assembly, was the enactment of the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standards Act, or AEPS. That was enacted back in 2004. So with that, our EDCs and electric generation suppliers are required to have a specific procurement of their generation by alternative resources that are sold to Pennsylvania consumers. And the goal of that act is to have 18% by 2021, and that's in May of 2021. So we're coming on that in a little over a year. Right now, of that percentage, we're at about 15.2% currently. Some of the examples of our qualifying resources under our AEPS is hydro, geothermal, wind, solar, biomass. But the reason why ours is not called a renewable portfolio standard is because we also include waste coal in that in Pennsylvania. I just also want to note that with our compliance year ending in May of 2013, we had about 21 million alternative energy credits, which were used by over 130 different entities in compliance with the AEPS. Approximately 50% of those credits were used for compliance were generated in Pennsylvania. But also want to note on the statutory landscape that Act 40 of 2017 closed the borders for solar credits. So now going forward, those credits must be generated here in Pennsylvania. Going on to the next slide, continuation of under our AEPS Act also is statutory language for net metering. With that, we have had a big increase in net metering customers. And if you look at 2011, we had about a little over 4,000. And moving forward to 2019, we have over 26,000 net meter customers. So the vast majority of these resources, I will note that they are rooftop solar array. Federal investment tax credits and a drastic price drop in the solar arrays have increased accessibility to the mass market. Total generation capacity associated with net meter customers in Pennsylvania has increased from about 178 megawatts to about 403 megawatts over the past 6 years. Moving on to the next slide. Another statutory change that we have dealt with here in Pennsylvania is that of energy efficiency, and that's under our Act 129 that was enacted back in 2008. And with that, I will note that our 7 major EDCs, and those are the ones that are over 100,000 customers, they now offer energy efficiency rebates and incentives for all classes. And so we have different phases that came out of Act 129, starting with the second phase that was from June 1st to 2013 through May 31st of 2016. Our energy efficiency programs demonstrated a lot of savings, about $1.70 for every dollar that was spent. And now we are currently in our phase 3, which goes from 2016 to 2021. And we see here that our EDCs have invested over $1.8 billion to support energy efficiency investments. And the expenditures are estimated to return a total benefit for ratepayers of about $2.7 billion. And that results in savings not as high as that we have seen in phase 2, but savings of about $1.40 for every dollar that is spent. Moving on to our next slide. As a result of some of these changes that we have done statutorily, We have also adopted, when we look at alternative energy and energy efficiency, we've adopted regulations promoting on-site generation by customer generators using renewable resources and have removed barriers to net metering. And a lot of those were, in terms of removing the barrier, we were working on streamlining the process for those customers, working with their EDCs to make sure that they got a lot of their renewable resources online. So our regulations provided for a compensation mechanism that reimburses customer generators for surplus energy supplied in the electric grid, which is a big factor here in Pennsylvania and probably in other states as well. In Pennsylvania, in terms of the reimbursement to customer generators, our statute talks about reimbursing them at full retail value. And what that has been interpreted to be by our electric distribution companies is full retail rate. And there's been a lot of discussion back and forth for whether or not that has been interpreted correctly. So Pennsylvania's laws and policies have offered predictable revenue resources or sources to alternative energy generators, which in turn have become less reliant on the PURPA provisions and more open to participating in the PJM wholesale market. So as I have given an overview of our energy landscape and changes that we have seen by statute over the years since 1978, I want to then get into looking at the PURPA NOPR starting on the next slide, and what we in this state have generally put in our comments. We note that Pennsylvania alternative energy generators are less reliant on PURPA provisions. We only have about 8 remaining contracts here in Pennsylvania. So our comments really want to focus on proposed revisions to qualifying facility rates that seek to incorporate competitive market forces into the determination of the avoided cost rate. So if we go into the next page, just want to identify in terms of what our comments say and what areas we supported. And our focus was mostly on, our focus generally was just on what we supported. It didn't get into other areas. So we supported FERC's proposal to allow a reduction of the electric utilities obligation to purchase from QFs to the extent of the obligation has been reduced by a state retail choice program. And I already talked to you about the fact that we entered into competition by our statute that was signed by the governor back in 1996 and went into effect in 1997. We also talked about in the proposal that we supported the proposal that would allow states the flexibility to match the contract terms of the provider of last resort supply solicitations to the length of the utilities PURPA purchase contract on a going forward basis. So we're going to go to the next slide then. We also talked about, we supported the proposed revision that would allow states the flexibility to require that as available qualifying facility energy rates to be based on the market's locational marginal price, or the LMP, or similar market-based energy price in effect at the time the energy is delivered. So some PA contracts have been structured this way already. And we also support companion proposal to grant states the flexibility to allow QFs to have a fixed energy rates, but to base them on projections of what energy prices will be at the time of delivery. And I think emphasis here also is the time of delivery. So this balances the QF's need for a steady stream of revenue with PA's EDC's responsibility to have a prudent mix of supply contracts for polar obligations. And this prudent mix comes out of our Act 129 2008 statute that was passed. So the next slide just says questions. So if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to take any questions. And also it shows our website, which has a lot of information, which would include our comments and also the different statutes that I just talked about. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. We will continue on here. And as I mentioned earlier, go ahead and provide your questions in either the chat box or the questions box on the right-hand side there. So next we have Heather Curley. She is of counsel at the firm Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati. Ms. Curley began her career on the litigation team representing PG&E in the regulatory proceedings arising from the California energy crisis. This role also involved representing IOUs in FERC proceedings related to the competitive energy and transmission markets. Ms. Curley joined WSGR in 2016, where she assists owners and operators of renewable energy projects in navigating state and federal regulatory challenges. She also represents SEIA and REBA in creating sustainable frameworks to support a vibrant clean energy economy. So, Ms. Curley, take it away.
Hello, everyone. This is Heather Curley from Wilson, and thanks to Elliott for the introduction, and thanks to Dr. Celebi for a really great, I think, economic analysis of this issue, both presented here and in some of the other pieces that he's done. And I think Pennsylvania provides such a great story of where we're trying to go and what PURPA is. But before I dive into my presentation or talk, and I just have a few short slides, you know, I was struck when Elliott reminded us that this organization began in 1976. And in 1976, you know, the talk of the day was really Amory Lovins, and he presented two paths. He said there is a hard path and a soft path. And the hard path was to keep doing things the way they've been done, and the soft path was to take a different approach. And I mean, I think over the past 30 or 40 years, people would say we probably have come down the hard path. And where we have found ourselves, I think, is exactly where he predicted we would be. And so I had one of his early article up here with me, and he really reminds us that, you know, economic answers are not always right answers, but properly using the markets we have may be the greatest single step we could take toward a sustainable, humane future. And I think that really sums up what PURPA is and what it can be. And so I represent industry. I represent people who want to build projects, whether they are, you know, solar, wind, storage. I represent people who do grid edge technologies and want to deliver behind the meter solutions to consumers. And I represent, you know, large producers of power, you know, at the transmission level and across the spectrum. And so, Elliott, let's go ahead and flip to the first slide. And in my mind, you know, PURPA really is an old story made new again. But I think this chart right here to the right tells a very interesting story. In 2018, there were 13.2 gigawatts of PPA signed for solar. Of those, 1% were PURPA projects. Yet, we devote substantial regulatory resources to really diving into some weedy details of PURPA projects. But the way I look at PURPA is about stimulating the development of competitively priced renewable generation in regions where it does not otherwise exist. Because very telling from this chart is 65% is voluntary procurement and another 21% is corporate procurement. There is a demand for these products, and I think that really, you know, should have us focus on what PURPA can be. And so, in my mind, I look at it as, you know, power. What we want here is a reliable and resilient electric grid. The way we get there is competition, because the cost of new solar today is lower than the avoided cost of energy and capacity in non-RTO regions. Not all, but some. And PURPA, 1978, when people were talking about the soft energy path, decided that the economic tool is the avoided cost of the electric utility. So what the utility otherwise doesn't purchase is what it pays the QF, balancing the interests of ratepayers as well as industry and development. But I think where we are today is innovation. Foundational paradigms have shifted. And in my mind, in states across the country, PURPA can build the framework necessary to support an emerging clean energy economy. Elliott, can you flip to the next slide for me? Because if done right, I think PURPA can deliver the benefits of competition to ratepayers. There was much talk in the comments at FERC that everything has changed, that there is no need for PURPA because there are competitive markets everywhere. But that is not true. Today, there's a patchwork of restructured and vertically integrated utilities across the United States. And PURPA ensures that all ratepayers will receive the benefits of competition. And we heard a lot of talk about how PURPA is bad for ratepayers because it locks them in to power contracts that are based on today's prices, and it commits the utility to pay for that power for a long term. And we saw some numbers come out. But when I look at it, what I see is that the $9 billion expansion of DC Summer was abandoned by SCANA. And the 2019 South Carolina Energy Freedom Act is using PURPA to deliver statewide benefits to residents. Because the truth is that over the next decade, the electric system will continue to shift to a lower carbon resource mix, but this lower emission electricity is going to be used to provide transportation and industrial processing services that today operate on fossil fuels. Our grid will be utilized and challenged in new ways to meet the delivery requirements of these new consumers, and customers will hold more power, with utilities and vendors innovating to take advantage of new opportunities behind the meter. And so, Elliott, can you flip to the next slide? So for the past 4 years, parties have engaged at FERC, and a number of states across the country have undertaken some deep dives on PURPA to dive into what it can be. And I think there are success stories across the states that have recently implemented PURPA programs that are seeing increasing economic development for their states. They are seeing lower rates for consumers, and they're seeing a reliable and resilient distributed system emerge under PURPA programs. But in my mind, and you'll see this reflected in the comments I wrote on behalf of SIA, who supports this as well, the NOPR fails to harness the power of competition for the benefit of the ratepayers. Because where QFs cannot access buyers other than the host utility, the circumstances have not changed since 1978. So we look at competition and getting competition to the market. And what you need is a predictable stream of revenue. That is what unlocks the capital necessary to deliver competitive renewable energy products. And what do you need to get capital? You need a price and term that are known at the time of contracting. So while the avoided cost energy rates can be forecasted and vary, they must be known at the time of contracting so the developers understand the revenue stream they can expect to receive. Avoided cost calculations should be transparent and compare apples to apples. We think that when the depreciation schedule of the units used in the avoided calculation should be equivalent to the contract term offered to the QF. But at the end of the day, the SIA put forth a proposal that hasn't received, that wasn't part of the NOPR, that competitive solicitations with sufficient adequate safeguards to protect against buyer market power can deliver substantial value. And so I think that is my perspective on PURPA and what it can be. I think SIA, for those of you who have not read our comments, has a lot of specific details. And so I'm happy to dive into those and take questions on those, but I think that's it for me at this point, Elliott.
All right, great. Thank you very much. So we will continue with Commissioner Kristine Raper, and we're actually getting some great questions already, so keep them coming. We'll tackle those again after we finish up with these opening remarks. Commissioner Raper is a commissioner at the Idaho Public Utilities Commission. She was appointed in February of 2015 for a 6-year term. Prior to her appointment, she served for 7 years as the Deputy Attorney General assigned to the Public Utility Commission. Raper managed a caseload representing a myriad of regulatory and energy law matters with a strong emphasis on PURPA, making her especially well suited for today's discussion. Commissioner Raper currently serves on NARUC's Electricity Committee. She is also the Vice Chair of the body of state regulators for the California ISO Energy Imbalance Market. And she's a member of the Western Interconnection Regional Advisory Board and State Provincial Steering Committee. So, Commissioner, please take us away.
Thank you, Elliott. I've had that bio read twice in the last week and a half, and it reminds me that I need to update my bio, but no matter, it's just movement between committees and councils and whatnot. So I am compelled to start with a disclaimer that I am one of 3 commissioners in Idaho. The views expressed here today are my own, but the Idaho Public Utilities Commission did file comments for the PURPA NOPR at FERC, and those comments speak for themselves and were signed by all 3 commissioners. So the first thing that I'm going to do is burst everyone's bubble. If they hadn't heard yet, Commissioner McNamee at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission late last week announced that he would not be seeking reappointment, and his appointment expires in June of this year. So for anyone who cares greatly about this issue, which if you're on the call, I would imagine that you do, cross your fingers that something that this quorum of 3 can accomplish prior to Commissioner McNamee's exit is to issue some rules or guidance on PURPA. I also find the juxtaposition of lining me up right behind Heather as a representative of QF developers and whatnot to be sort of comical. I only have a couple of slides, and I would rather respond to comments than take up a bunch of time. Idaho's position is pretty well known, I think, across the country. The electricity market looks entirely different now than it did in 1978 when PURPA was enacted. There's a diminishing reliance on fossil fuels. We are no longer at risk of becoming energy dependent on another nation, and access to organized markets has changed the landscape. Congress did contemplate periodic review, which, to the best of my knowledge, the only other substantial changes that were made to PURPA were in the 2005. Relevance of the Act, I don't believe is being challenged. I want to acknowledge and appreciate Commissioner Glick's dissent, and I know that that is the crux of his argument, that if the relevance of the Act is being challenged, then that is something for Congress to decide, and I don't disagree with him. If somebody's trying to overthrow the Act as a whole, then Congress needs to be the one to repeal the Act. I do believe, however, that there should be consideration of whether the current construct is actually furthering the objectives of PURPA. And PURPA does not only have a stated goal of developing small renewables. PURPA also says that we should encourage conservation of energy, we should encourage optimization of the efficient use of the facilities and resources that are already in place, and we should encourage equitable rates to consumers. So I think that the dialogue that overarches everything and sort of pushes everything to the corners is development of renewables, but supporting only the development of renewables without regard for the consumers is inconsistent with the tenets of the Act, and it's a violation of the public interest. Any rules that FERC puts in place should balance both the promotion of small renewable power producers along with the reliability of the system and clearly ratepayer indifference, which is specifically noted and cited both in the Act and in the rules. So the next slide, which is the only other slide that I have, sort of is an overview of the position that the Idaho Commission took in its comments in response to the NOPR. We believe that FERC has granted flexibility to the states in determining an appropriate calculation for avoided cost. We would continue to promote and support that position. I would note a couple of things. In the NOPR, FERC, part of its proposal considered basing an avoided cost calculation on natural gas prices. And with the way that natural gas is being utilized and its diminishing role, I would say, within the electric system, I think that basing anything on a natural gas price at this point might not be the best basis for a calculation going forward. I say that when we actually have our standard rate based on a natural gas cycle unit. So we in Idaho will clearly need to update based on whatever final rule that FERC comes out with. I find it interesting when people talk about avoided costs, they talk about how the QF needs a reasonable opportunity to attract capital. Metin used that language, reasonable opportunity to attract capital, and Heather also said predictable stream of revenue. Now, while I understand that FERC in decisions that it has issued has utilized that type of language, there is nothing that I am aware of in the Act or the rules that guarantees the renewable developer a revenue stream. It has always been, in my knowledge of the regulatory world, that if it cannot be built for a reasonable and prudent cost, then you need to look to other sources in order for the utility to generate and provide the power to its customers. So overpricing something simply in order for the QF to be able to attract capital or get a predictable stream of revenue, I think is not consistent with the Act and rules, although it may be based on an interpretation of some FERC decisions that have come out. We would continue to advocate for flexibility that FERC has generally granted with regard to avoided cost calculations. I would say also that the ability to have fixed prices and a projection of prices into the future on a long-term contract, I don't think is in the utility or customer's best interest either. I think that our history shows, our history in Idaho at least, shows that we are not very good at projecting where energy prices would go. And I would say that the majority of the country probably did not think that natural gas prices would drop below $2. So if you give a QF a 20-year contract and you don't have some variable that allows for a modification of that avoided cost rate in order for it to continue to reflect the true avoided cost to the utility for the generation of that power, then you're already outside the parameters of the Act and what the Act is trying to do. The current irrebuttable 1 mile rule has led to gaming of the rules, which has ultimately been detrimental to the ratepayers. I would support, and this commission supports in its comments, the rebuttable presumption that they want to put in place that something between 1 mile and 10 miles may be related, but that you can look to see if it's truly a single generator or multiple generators. And for anyone who hasn't heard the reference, we, through 2010 to present, have gone through iterations of projects that have been submitted to us, a project of 520 megawatt wind QFs, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo. Now, if you couldn't at first glance notice that those might be related, they meet the irrebuttable 1 mile rule. They're where they attach to the utility system is 1 mile apart, but to look at those on the landscape, you would never know that those 5 projects are 5 separate projects because the windmills line up right against each other. 10 miles would push that distance further apart, along with the new definition for generating units. I can't remember the specific language of that, but it would, in my opinion, prevent the gaming that has occurred thus far, that where you can put windmills and solar panels kind of anywhere you want, and having them 1 mile apart doesn't really make them separate projects. And clearly a 100 megawatt project is not within the parameters of PURPA. We, the commission, did speak to non-discriminatory access in organized markets, although we are not currently in an organized market. We are working our way in that direction. The 20 megawatt threshold that was enunciated and put in place in 2005, I think that there's been sufficient evidence shown in the NOPR itself, by the proposal by FERC and also by the other commenters, that probably something less than 20 megawatts would be adequate, and generators smaller than 20 megawatts still have non-discriminatory access in those types of markets. I look to the organized markets to know what works best within their realm. Regarding legally enforceable obligations, I think everyone acknowledged, QFs and utilities and developers and commissions alike, that the legally enforceable obligation issue has come up often and is a hotly contested issue as to when that legally enforceable obligation actually attaches. The states currently have the authority to determine when a legally enforceable obligation is incurred, and the Idaho Commission believes that the states ought to continue to have the authority to determine when that legally enforceable obligation attaches. And I think that the proposal by FERC that there be a demonstration of commercial viability and a financial commitment is a good way for the utilities to be able to begin to rely on the generation that will provide for their system. If all you do is say that once the contract is submitted, or once a request is submitted by a QF to a utility, that suddenly there's a legally enforceable obligation, the utility at that point has no basis for relying on that power. If they needed to make a choice as to whether to build generation or rely on the power of a QF that hadn't even yet obtained financing to build their project but was trying to negotiate terms with the utility, I think that there are many commissions in the country that would find that that utility would be in error to not look to other generation resources until that QF was further along the path of actually building. And I base that on the history in Idaho that shows that many of these contracts that begin to get negotiated, and some of the contracts that even come in front of the commission for approval, are not only not actually built, some of them move their operation date, their commercial operation date, out by 6 months, a year, 18 months, and the utility has to be able to reliably serve its customers. So until something is put in place to ensure that the QF is going to be able to come online, be able to build, then putting some parameters in place for when a legally enforceable obligation attaches is appropriate. The final issue, as Elliott posed it and that we addressed in our comments, was the challenge to self-certification. So Idaho supports the ability to challenge a QF self-certification on a Form 556 at FERC. I've been looking into this further even since we've filed our comments, and was a little disturbed. We did not acknowledge in our comments, but I think it's appropriate to have the dialogue, when the FERC NOPR addressed allowing a challenge to that self-certification. They had a 30-day timeline, 30 days from the date upon which the QF files its Form 556 at FERC. the Utility Commission, anyone can challenge that self-certification. And what we have recently realized, maybe we should have sooner, but it's been brought more to our attention with some of our dockets recently, that 30 days from the time the QF files at FERC is not the appropriate trigger for any kind of timeline to challenge a self-certification. At the point that most of those QFs, in Idaho's experience, at the point at which most QFs file that Form 556 at FERC, they haven't negotiated with the utility. They're not in contact with the commissions. And if there is an error on the Form 556 that would be challenged by anyone against the QF, it wouldn't become realized or obvious until after those negotiations have gone on and more of the solid facts and evidence show up in the case, until a generation profile is provided, until you know more about what the geography of the area is, what the setup is, how much they might be able to generate, how they would put that on the utility system. And so I would say that a challenge to a self-certification is absolutely appropriate, but a 30-day timeline that is triggered the minute that the QF files that with FERC is not the appropriate timeline to have that triggered. I think if the underlying facts and evidence don't become obvious until either negotiation with the utility or filing with the state commission, maybe that's when that 30-day trigger can come into play. Because I know that our staff, when a QF contract is filed here for approval or disapproval, our staff begins to look at the Form 556. They look at the generation profile. They look at the particulars of how the QF is set up and will add energy to the utility system. And so I believe that would be the appropriate trigger. I regret that those things were not included in our comments in front of FERC. And the final thing that I would say is that the PURPA NOPR did not address batteries or battery storage, and that is unfortunate. I know that when this began several years ago, and Paul Schalander, my colleague, and I testified at a technical hearing, and FERC began this process of looking at PURPA for some changes and modifications. Battery storage and the way that that might appear in this environment was not obvious, but it has become more obvious over time. My argument for that would be that PURPA does not actually directly address batteries. And I hope that sometime in the near future, somebody puts some sidebars on how battery storage could, would, might, should be handled either within PURPA or not. So I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. And I would also say, as far as Heather's presentation of competition and competition under PURPA, PURPA is the absence of competition, not the substitution of competition. It has been Idaho's experience that QFs have actually become a barrier to entry of competitive renewable projects, because if a QF is forcing the utility to accept energy on its system, then any RFP that the utility would otherwise do to bring on renewable developers becomes moot. They no longer need the energy when a QF developer comes in and it's a must purchase, must take environment. So I will stop there.
All right, thank you very much, Commissioner. And we certainly appreciate the wide spectrum of perspectives on this issue. And with that, I think Ms. Eaton can really share Xcel's unique perspective, particularly as a large utility with a multi-state and actually a multi-interconnection footprint. They have a variety of regulatory regimes, and they also operate both within and outside of 2 organized markets, including SPP and MISO. So Terri Eaton is a senior director with the Federal Regulatory Affairs at Xcel Energy. She initially worked as a staff attorney for the Public Utility Commission of Texas, handling various electricity-related issues, including those associated with the state's transition to retail competition. Subsequently, she joined Green Mountain Energy, which is a competitive retailer in Austin, Texas, and she was the manager of governmental affairs there. Since September of 2005, Ms. Eaton has been with Xcel Energy in various positions, and in her current role, she is responsible for Xcel's compliance programs, as well as FERC regulatory matters, which of course includes PURPA. She has a bachelor's degree of science in petroleum engineering, as well as a law degree from the University of Texas at Austin. So with that, I'll turn it over to Terri Eaton.
Thank you, Elliott, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you folks today. I want to give just a brief overview of the company, and I'll talk a little bit about the need for PURPA reform, and then I think part of the title of this webinar was whether we could find common ground, and I have a few thoughts of at least at a really high level where we all might have common ground. First, I'm on slide 3. We have 3.5 million customers and 2 million electric customers and 2 million natural gas customers in 8 states. As you can see from the map on this slide, we are located in the upper Midwest and the West and Southwest. We are fortunate to be located in some of the most wind and solar-rich areas of the country. I think a lot of times folks that are advocating for PURPA reform or actually repeal of PURPA get tagged as anti-renewable, but that is not the case in my experience. Our company has been a national wind leader for more than a decade, as determined by AWEA. We are number 4 in renewable states outside of California, and number 1 outside of California. And in 2016, we got a Greenhouse Gas Leadership Award from the Environmental Protection Agency. You may also be aware that we committed late last year to, late, I guess, 2018, to some fairly aggressive greenhouse gas goals. We committed to be 80% carbon-free from 2005 levels by 2030, with the goal, assuming cost-effective technologies come along, to be 100% carbon-free by 2050. Slide 4 just gives you a sense of the amount of wind and solar that we have added to our system over the last little bit more than about a decade, and you can see some pretty dramatic increases between 2010 and 2017 in wind and solar on our system, and further projected dramatic increases through 2022, and obviously beyond if we intend to meet our 2030 goals. On slide 5, I just wanted to show the trajectory of our customer bills. Part of our objective is to provide clean energy while still keeping customer bills low. And as you can see here, our customer bills are below the rate of inflation. So we're managing to keep our customer bills low while we're aggressively adding renewables to our system. I'm on slide 6. I just want to talk a little bit about the need for PURPA reform. A key principle of PURPA is that customers should be indifferent to QF and energy and capacity, meaning customers should not see any difference in their bills depending upon whether they get energy and capacity from a QF or from their utility. A study published by Concentric Energy Advisors near the end of last year shows that in the absence of market-based pricing mechanisms for QF energy and capacity, customers are not indifferent. Market-based pricing mechanisms can deliver more renewables at the same price as non-market-based mechanisms. I'm not exactly sure what I meant when I wrote that. The Concentric study shows, though, that you can add 2 megawatts of competitively priced renewable energy for every 1 megawatt that's added using administrative mechanisms for setting PURPA prices. It also has a 1.5 to 1 ratio for wind, meaning you can add more wind if QF energy is based on market-based prices rather than administratively determined prices. So not only are QFs, especially in states that aren't using market-based mechanisms, not only are customers suffering through higher bills than they otherwise need pay, but the ability to expand renewables on those systems, assuming a static cost of investment, is diminished. You can add more renewables to the system if QFs are forced to live with market-based prices. So customers are better off, and we can get to our clean energy objectives faster through PURPA reform. FERC's proposed solutions will give states more tools to manage customer cost exposure. And I want to be really clear about this. FERC isn't mandating anything for states. They're giving states more clarity about what their options are. And in particular, they've set out some opportunities for states to use market-based prices, including nodal prices for states that are in restructured markets, in RTO and ISO markets, market hub pricing for entities that aren't inside those restructured markets. The Commission asked for comment on whether EIM prices, energy imbalance market prices, mimic LMPs. We believe they do, and we said so in our comments. So in my mind, if you're in an EIM, those EIM prices should also be a mechanism for determining market-based prices and through competitive procurement. FERC has also let states have some ability to determine what the pricing horizon is that they want to use for their contracts for QF. So do you want your contract to set a long-term fixed price, or do you want your contract to set prices at the time of delivery? I think we've shown, history has shown that prices have decreased pretty dramatically. We expect them to continue to decrease as more renewables come onto the system. So setting a fixed price contract at today's prices is likely to do nothing but ensure that your customers are going to be overpaying even 1-2 years down the road for energy under those contracts. So the ability to price at the time of delivery is a significant benefit to customers. And as Commissioner Raper already talked about, the Commission also is clarifying that states have the ability to determine when a QF establishes a legally enforceable obligation. This is really important. We've seen a lot of QFs really attempt to abuse that process. For instance, in New Mexico, a QF asserted that they established the right to a legally enforceable obligation, which in their mind meant that at that point in time they established that obligation, the price for that contract is established at that point in time. This QF in New Mexico said, well, I created this obligation in 2011, but I don't have to build that project anytime soon. In fact, I could wait for 20 years to build that project. So what that QF was trying to do was really game the system. Say, I'll get a 2011 price, and I'll just wait until my costs drop significantly, and then I can go extract a windfall from customers. So essentially, QFs have been using or attempting to use the establishment of a legally enforceable obligation as a free option. Say, I get to establish the price at this point in time, and then I get to decide when, some point down the road, I decide I can make enough money off that contract to go forward and build. And that also goes to Commissioner Raper's point that without having some firmness and some definitiveness as to when that QF is going to show up, the utility's ability to plan for their system is really completely disrupted. Commissioner Raper already talked about addressing the 1 mile rule and then reduction of the 20 megawatt safe harbor down to 1 megawatt. I just note that I think that makes sense. FERC has decided that DERs as small as 100 kW have the wherewithal to participate in wholesale markets. If DERs as small as 100 kW have the ability and the wherewithal to participate in wholesale markets, then certainly QFs that are 1 megawatt and larger have the ability to participate in those wholesale markets. The last point I just wanted to get to was areas of common ground. First, I think that there might be widespread agreement that getting PURPA right is a key to advancing clean energy goals. I already talked about the fact that if QFs are extracting more value for their projects than the market would otherwise demand, that means that given the same amount of money, we're installing less clean energy than we otherwise would. So we got to get this right so that we can use the customer's money effectively to bring as much clean energy onto the system as possible. Second, I think, as I noted earlier, PURPA was designed to make sure that it was intended to be sure that customers were indifferent as to whether they got their energy from a QF or utility. PURPA was never intended to advantage QF developers at the expense of customers. And I believe we can probably all agree on that point. And then I think we can also agree, back when PURPA was adopted in 1978, we did a whole different world than we have today. We didn't have a lot of IPPs out there. We didn't have competitive markets. States weren't using RFP processes to procure energy for the systems. That's changed dramatically. We have RTOs now across the majority of the country. We have states, including our states, in particular Minnesota and Colorado, use pretty robust competitive procurement process to procure energy. They manage pretty robust competitive process that are used to procure energy for our systems. And we have quite a few IPPs out there. So the world that existed in 1978 when PURPA came along is dramatically different today. And so I believe that there is a case to be made, given the growth of market mechanisms since 1978, that really market-based mechanisms ought to be the mechanism that we use to price QF energy and capacity. And there are stuff.
Well, terrific. Certainly, I had the fear of 5 panelists that might result in something like this, which is a little bit of a time crunch. We've gotten some great questions. You know, I got a couple that were specific to an individual panelist presentation, and for those, we're going to follow up individually after the webinar. I did receive a question that was better than the ones I had drafted up last week, and that is one that I'm going to just pose to our panel, and I think this will probably be the only question. But how might FERC's changes recently to the minimum offer price rule, or MOPR, for capacity affect prices related to PURPA? And how can we set up a robustly competitive process that would enable meaningful competition for all new capacity, both between utilities and QFs, but also across all sources of new capacity? And I'll just leave it open to the floor.
I'm going to jump in first, but I'm going to be quick because I think Dr. Celebi is probably going to have really great things to say here. But I will just say I think it is an opportunity across the industry to ask the question of how do you best procure competitive all-source generation, whether through PURPA or through regional capacity markets. And so I think it's a great time to ask these questions, but I will turn it over to others who know more than I do.
This is Terri. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Terri.
I was going to address both of those questions, and I'm sorry, Dr. Celebi, if I jumped on top of you. I did want to talk a little bit about the MOPR rule. I think first we should all recognize that I think most of the utilities in PJM have the exemption down to 20 megawatts. So I think the impacts of the MOPR will be somewhat muted. My guess is if the MOPR rule stands, and I think that's an open question at this point, that I would expect that it might nudge up capacity prices for QF energy a little bit. Exactly what that would look like, I'm not entirely sure. I think those resources would have to, and I actually don't know how that works specifically in PJM. I would expect they would have to participate in those capacity auctions, and that's where they would get their capacity payment. It might nudge that up a little bit. But I'm not positive about that. I did want to say about a robust competitive procurement process. Colorado's process was really helpful as a model in the NRRI white paper that was, I think, at least in part authored by Travis Kavula. And I believe that Colorado process is really a model that states could look at. That process developed over a 30-year time horizon with a lot of input from developers and commissioners, and as a result of that robust process, the last RFP we had over 400 bids submitted for 238 different types of projects. We have a very robust competitive developer community operating here in Colorado, and we spent a little bit of time trying to understand what the key aspects of that competitive process are, and I can give you some of those. The first is that the state's in control of the process. They hire an independent reviewer of those bids that are submitted, so there is control over that process. Through the ERP process, the state defines the need, and that need is filled. We're not sending out exploratory RFPs. The RFPs we issue are to fill a need or used or to fill that need. In addition, the criteria that will be used for the evaluation are part of the litigated part of the ERP process. The contract template that we'll use when we're all said and done and want to sign up a QF, that contract template is transparent and litigated in advance. So everybody knows what the rules are going in. And so I think that is really, those are, I think, the key aspects of what's really driven that valuable process in Colorado. And also, I should say, those RFPs occur about every 4 years. And so I feel like the regularity of the process, the state control and oversight of the process, the transparency, and the opportunity for developers to weigh in and to have a say through that litigated process as to what the criteria look like, what the contract template looks like. I think all those factors have played a role in making the Colorado process very effective. And I'll be quiet now.
Thanks, Terri. This is Metin. If I can just try to supplement what you said, I generally agree with your responses with respect to the MOPR. I haven't evaluated the details of how that will impact the capacity prices, but if it is in force, it would likely bump them up, and that to the extent the QF capacity rates are tied to the PJM capacity prices, they would also increase. But again, I haven't studied it in detail. With respect to the RFP competitive process, to get competition, robust competition across all sources, the principles that Terri outlined all make sense. I think they should be in proper RFPs. But maybe if I can just try to supplement it, before the RFP, all the needs need to be properly specified for capacity energy ramping needs. And since different kinds of resources will be competing in the RFP, the evaluation criteria should take into account the differences in the hourly and sub-hourly profile of generation, their capacity credit, and ramping capability to make sure that whoever is winning gets the lowest cost, highest value resource option to the ratepayers.
Well, excellent. I think we are coming to the end here, but I do want to ask one more brief question, and I'm going to go through the panel and ask you all to also, in addition to answering this, just any additional closing thoughts. But I do want to note that we did see in Xcel's comments and other comments the concern of the cost associated with integrating qualified facilities that may be outside of the IRPs, or in fact are outside the IRPs. And Dr. Celebi sort of mentioned the oversubscription. Perhaps you all could share your thoughts about the need for utility resource planning that takes into account the potential system impacts of QFs. And if these avoided cost rates could somehow account for the integrated costs, how could these be measured and accurately reflected? And for responses, we'll start in the same order as the presentations. So Dr. Celebi, start us off, please.
Yeah, sure thing. I have a few thoughts on that. To the extent the particular QF imposes some integration cost that would, relative to utility doing it from its own resources and other types of purchases, those should be considered and be part of the avoided cost formula. And those estimates, the integration cost estimates, they should be updated frequently as a function of the entry of both the QF and non-QF renewables, since the integration cost will typically increase with the cumulative entry of new renewables. One challenge with considering the potential system impacts of QFs have been the uncertainty of the online date and the level of QF entry in the future, because it's a cumulative problem. If you don't know how much is going to enter when, it's hard to estimate what will be the integration cost for a particular QF resource to be included in the avoided cost rates. So some of the terms in the NOPR with respect to the commercial viability and financial commitment, I think goes towards easing some of those concerns on the unpredictability of the timing and the level of QF entry. So I'm going to stop there.
All right. Next, Chairman Dutrieuille.
Thank you. Well, I actually would just defer to those vertically integrated states. We in Pennsylvania are not one of them, and we no longer develop the RFPs, so it's hard for me to give an answer to that.
Oh, sorry, that's me. Sorry, Heather. So the way I think of it is that, at the end of the day, the fate is in the hands of the system planners. Paradigms have shifted, and we have these low and zero cost marginal resources. They are fuelless. They are predictable but intermittent. We have massive capabilities of energy storage. And again, there's a huge competitive industry out there ready to build and supply these needs the moment they are identified. And so, I think on this group of state regulators, I think I would just encourage that the system planners are planning for the future that we have coming for us rather than the system that we have known, and that those efficiencies in planning will play out in efficiencies in acquisition.
All right, thank you. And next, Heather Curley.
Oh, sorry, I thought that was my role. So somebody else, I took somebody's slot.
Commissioner Raper, sorry about that.
So you're talking IRP, not RFP, right? Be able to plan for the future?
Correct.
That was my error. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, okay. Too many acronyms. I don't know the answer to that, because that has been the problem to date, right? Idaho has a long positive history with PURPA projects, but when it became a problem was when federal subsidies and tax breaks became part of the picture, so that people were motivated to find ways to get a bunch of energy on the system and also get the benefit of those tax incentives. And so that was when Idaho's issues came into play, was when the glut of projects came in. And the only way that I can think that you could allow a utility to begin to plan for megawatts on their system is to somehow max that number out each year, say, allow for so many megawatts of energy. And I think it goes to what Dr. Celebi was saying, that for every project that goes on, the value of the energy produced by a subsequent QF goes down, right? Because you've already got that energy on the system, and that differential should take place. But at a given point, a small system, which Idaho, some of our peak days are at about 1,300 megawatts, you can't get a glut of 120 megawatt projects coming on the system and be able to absorb that and plan for it. So the only way I can think of for the utility to be able to mitigate the risk of that is maybe to have some kind of a maximum number of megawatts through PURPA that they have to absorb per year. That's just, that's about what I got.
All right, thank you. And of course, we'll finish here with Terri Eaton. Anything to add?
Yeah, if I could take just a couple minutes. First, I think we look at these integration costs as part of our ERP process, and the RFPs are part and parcel of the ERP process. First, I think it's really important to remember that if you have QFs sitting out of your RFP process, that's going to drive costs up. You want everybody that's interested in building in your state participating in that RFP, so you get the most robust competition possible in that RFP process. When our state in Colorado in particular, is looking at bids that are submitted through the RFP process, they have a lot of decisions to make. They've got public policy interest to look at in terms of what resource mix they want. They've got to take into account customer cost. they've got to take into account the all-in cost of the resources that they're looking at procuring. So we provide the state with charts that show what the integration costs look like for renewables, because they're not free and they impose additional costs on the system in terms of gas management cost, additional resources that we have to have available to manage like large wind fall-off events. We have to have excess capacity available. There's other factors such as unit cycling. All of those issues associated with renewables increase costs. So when the state decides through the resource plan what resources they want to add, they're kind of taking all of that into consideration and coming up with an amount of cost that they expect customers to bear. When you have a QF come in later outside of that process, if they don't have to be responsible for their integration costs, they're imposing those incremental integration costs on customers. And in that case, customers are not indifferent to that QF energy because they're paying more for that energy than they would otherwise have to. And so I think the appropriate answer is to say that avoided costs should take into account those increases in integration costs that will have to be borne by the utility to integrate that QF's energy. And as part of that, when the state does an ERP, they look at the cost associated with a resource, the all-in cost, including transmission cost. If you have a QF come along outside the ERP, absent some sort of affirmative state action to say you're going to have to bear the cost of those transmission upgrades, the QF doesn't have any incentive to site anywhere near transmission. They could try and impose tens, even hundreds of millions of dollars of transmission cost onto customers. And so again, that's another integration cost, or I think it falls within the bucket of integration cost, or the general category that the state needs to be mindful of and make sure they take steps to protect customers from having to bear the cost of bad siting decisions on the part of QFs. So I think it's important to meet the PURPA indifference principle that avoided costs take into account not only the cost of the energy, but the other costs imposed on customers by virtue of that QF's energy.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much, and appreciate the panel's participation again. This is a very robust and hopefully a very useful discussion for those that joined us today. I do want to wrap up here with a couple of important announcements, starting with NRRI. Of course, our Winter Policy Summit is just 10 days away from now here in Washington, D.C., and we've got some excellent speakers, including not one, but two assistant secretaries from DOE and two FERC commissioners. Additionally, we'll have NRRI's new president, Brandon Presley, who will be moderating a panel. And a little later this month, we'll have NRRI's Center for Partnerships and Innovation. They'll be hosting a webinar on February 20th focused on how commissions respond and coordinate during energy emergencies. And as for NRRI, we have actually started, Tom Stanton and I, working on a PURPA tracker project, much like the net neutrality tracker on the website now. And once we roll this out, it's going to include a summary of where states currently stand with regards to PURPA. We're hoping this will be a very useful tool for state commissions and other interested parties. Data will include how many, for example, qualified facilities in each state, recent commission decisions and state legislation. And for the 14 states that submitted comments, we want to include sort of summaries of for each component of the NOPR. So we're starting this effort by focusing on the states that actually did submit comments, but we also want to include those that have, or at least plan to add, a lot of QFs in the future. And we're trying to partner with the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, as they've already initiated a similar project that has some overlap. So please stay tuned for that. We're hoping to release this with an NRRI Insights paper, and hopefully that'll be sort of timed well with the final reaction from FERC on the NOPR comments. For those attending NRRI's Winter Policy Summit that I mentioned earlier, we certainly invite you to attend our RTI luncheon on Monday, February 10th from 11:45 to 1:15 p.m. In addition to a free lunch, we're going to provide some updates on the status of the Regulatory Training Initiative, or RTI, and that'll include plans for a remote training pilot and a discussion on how the RTI will benefit state commissions, commission staff, and other stakeholders. So while there is no charge for the lunch, we do ask that you register in advance. And last but not least, the next webinar that NRRI will be hosting will be on March 11th, and that's going to focus on the telecommunications industry. And we'll have more details up on our website shortly. And again, the website is nrri.org. Just a reminder, today's webinar will be posted on YouTube. So for those who are interested, you can share it with your colleagues. An announcement will go out, but please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And with that, I'm going to close it out here. Thanks again for joining us today, and a special thanks to our panel. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.